So how many acres does the university own? It's 195 acres. Was once part of an 1,100 acre plantation owned by Judge Richard Parker, who was the judge, of course, who presided over John Brown's trial. That house right there was called the Retreat, so the plantation was known as the Retreat. Judge Parker, although he owned the property, he spent most of his time living at his home in Winchester.
I'm sorry, in where?
In Winchester. And I will say, just as a little aside before we officially get on the Cool Spring track, you know, this site is just kind of revealing stuff to us all the time. Over the past several years, my students and I have been researching. I am becoming more and more convinced this property was the stop on the Underground Railroad. Ooh. Because there's a lot of documentary evidence that we have and some local legends about an old sycamore tree. I'll point this out to you. An old sycamore tree that was hollowed out that runaway slaves would hide in. We found what I believe is that tree. It's massive, and next Tuesday we're going to start running tests to determine the age of the tree. Because obviously the Underground Railroad didn't keep records, so it'd be nice if they were like, it was this tree. But in any event, now we're going to get into Cool Spring mode. So, on the night of July the 12th, 1864, Jubal Early, commanding the Confederate Army of the Valley, began the process of withdrawing from Washington, D.C. back into the Shenandoah Valley. As Confederate forces were leaving the northern periphery of Washington that night, Confederate soldiers, including Jubal Early, were trying to figure out what their march to Washington, what their march to the gates of the national capital actually meant. And Jubal Early made a boast to one of the members of his staff, Major Henry Kidd Douglas, that has kind of become somewhat famous. And it is this, and some of you have probably heard this before. And Early said, "We haven't taken Washington, but we've scared Abe Lincoln like hell." It's a great statement. It's very powerful. Clearly, Early thought his campaign achieved something. But as a historian, I want to know, is this actually how Lincoln felt, or is Jubal Early projecting this is how Lincoln felt? It's pretty clear to me that when you look at the real-time letters and diaries, not things written decades after the war, but things written in that moment, that Lincoln was not scared of Jubal Early. Washington was completely encircled in fortifications, manned with heavy artillery. Lincoln, if he felt any emotion in that second week of July as Confederate forces pushed to the northern boundary of the capital, he was aggravated, he was annoyed, he was ticked off. And as Jubal Early began his withdrawal that night of July the 12th, Abraham Lincoln wanted one thing. He wanted Jubal Early pursued, and then he wanted him destroyed. So very quickly, a force of about 35,000 Union soldiers, placed under the command of General Horatio Wright, is cobbled together from all of the different forces in and around Washington, and forces that are sent from Petersburg to help protect Washington, troops from the 6th Corps. They are placed under the command of General Horatio Wright, and Horatio Wright begins his pursuit late on the afternoon of July the 13th. That pursuit ends here at the Battle of Cool Spring. What we think of today as the Battle of Cool Spring was not known as the Battle of Cool Spring during the Civil War. You would be hard-pressed to find a soldier on either side identifying this battle, writing about this battle as the Battle of Cool Spring. It is oftentimes known as the Battle of Island Ford, the Battle of Snicker's Gap, the Battle of Snicker's Ferry, the Battle of Parker's Island, but never Cool Spring. The battle name is applied by modern-day historians referencing the Cool Spring mansion on the other side of the Shenandoah River that is now owned by that closed order of Cistercian monks. Now, the Battle of Cool Spring begins on July 17th, about 1.25 miles that way, at Castleman's Ferry. So basically where the bridge carries over the Shenandoah River, that's the area of Castleman's Ferry. So there's fighting there all throughout the day on July 17th. Confederates commanded by General John B. Gordon were on the west side of the river. Union cavalry commanded by General Alfred Dufay and a brigade of infantry commanded by Colonel James Mulligan were duking it out all throughout the course of the day. DeFay and Mulligan trying to force that crossing, and they failed. There was more of the same sort of failure on the part of the Union force on the morning of July 18th. And after that failure, that last failure around 9:30, 10 o'clock that morning, General George Crook, who was commanding a part of Horatio Wright's pursuit force, he decided that we had to try a different way. Because if you keep doing the same thing over and over and over again, and you're expecting a different result, that's insanity. And so George Crook decided that we would take part of his force, about 5,000 men commanded by Colonel Joseph Thoburn, move them through paths in the Blue Ridge Mountains, come across this property. So if you're standing right here around 3 o'clock on the afternoon of July 18th, you would have seen 5,000 Union soldiers moving down what at the time of the Civil War was known as Parker's Ford Road. They traversed this landscape and crossed the Shenandoah River at Island Ford, and we'll eventually get to that point where they crossed. After they crossed the river, the plan initially was turn south and attack the Confederate flank. However, once they got across, George Crook and Horatio Wright, they could see the shimmering of bayonets and musket barrels in the distance. And that shimmering was actually coming from troops commanded by General Gabriel Wharton, a division commander, and another division commanded by General Robert Rhodes. And so as they were moving toward Island Ford, Horatio Wright and George Crook told Thoburn, "You just stay put." And that decision basically sets up the Battle of Cool Springs. So the fighting begins around 5 o'clock that evening. And we'll get into a little bit more of the detail as we move along the tour this morning. It lasts until shortly after sunset. So sunset in 1864 is 7:39 p.m. They don't have daylight savings time yet, so 8:39 p.m. our time. So once you get to about between the 8 and 9 o'clock hour, the battle ends. It's a tactical Confederate victory. Federals retreat back to this side of the river. When Union war planners in Washington, D.C. learn about the Battle of Snicker's Gap, Island Ford, Cool Spring, whatever you'd like to call it, they are not impressed. Assistant Secretary of War Charles Dana believed that this battle, which involved 13,000 soldiers, about 8,000 Confederates, 5,000 Federals, a battle which produces almost 1,000 casualties combined, Union and Confederate. Charles Dana believed that it achieved absolutely nothing. From a strategic standpoint, Jubal Early was as much a threat after Cool Spring as he was before it, to either launch another invasion toward Washington or launch an invasion into Pennsylvania. Even though this battle strategically meant nothing to people in Washington, tactically it's a defeat. To the soldiers who fought here, it meant a great deal. One of the individuals who was struck, not by what happened during the Battle of Cool Spring, but what had happened in the aftermath of the battle, on that night of July 18th and into the morning of July the 19th, was this woman right here, Edith Thomas. Edith Thomas was 9 years old when the Battle of Cool Spring was fought, but she grew up to become a very famous poet in the 1890s and early 1900s. As she was growing up in Ohio, and there were a number of regiments from Ohio who fought at Cool Spring, Edith Thomas was hearing stories about the Union retreat and the efforts to evacuate wounded soldiers from the western shore to the eastern side of the river. She was so struck by these stories she had heard as a child, she remembered them in her adulthood. And in 1893, she wrote a poem entitled A Christopher of the Shenandoah. And the poem really focuses on the retreat and the Herculean efforts to evacuate wounded soldiers from across that body of water to this side of the river and to get them medical care. That poem, which has today largely been forgotten, was a mainstay in the 1890s and early 1900s at Memorial Day ceremonies, as evoking ideas of duty and patriotism and camaraderie among soldiers. So it really is the stories that inspired her to write this poem that is going to guide us throughout our tour this morning. So I feel like every year we do a tour of the Battle of Cool Spring, and then it's always so god-awful hot. Everybody's all drenched in sweat and has lost about 5 pounds. And we don't get into the nitty-gritty of the aftermath. And so that's why today, that's what we're going to focus on. All right? So I'll take questions if you have them, and if not, we're going to head up on the path in this direction.
Cool Spring, where's the name? Is there a spring around here called that? I mean, where's that?
Yeah, there is a cool spring behind the Cool Spring Mansion.
Okay.
On the other side of it.
I realize focus on the aftermath, but just a question about Castleman's
Ferry?
Ferry. So what exactly was the Union thinking? Because the Confederates were on that other side. I mean, how were they going to get across? Were they just trying to decimate them with cannons, and then they were going to ride the ferry across, or just exactly what were they trying to do?
So the thinking was, and it's maybe hard for us to imagine today because we've had a lot of rain and the river is super high. There was a drought in July of 1864, and so you didn't need a ferry to get across. River came up at best to knee height, and so it was just like a little stream in essence at that point because of the severe drought. So the idea was, we'll come off the mountain, and they're charging with cavalry and using dismounted cavalry to try to force them out. Horatio Wright really never believed that Jubal Early would have his entire force concentrated in this area. He thought that after he pulled out of Washington, that he was actually just going to come in the valley, head south, and then cut back over to Petersburg. And so he's thinking there's not even going to be a lot of soldiers there. It should be an easy task, which obviously Horatio Wright was very, very wrong in that.
Was the weather and temperature comparable to today?
Yes, so this is designed specifically for you. So I believe in immersive learning experiences. It was super hot, and actually I'd crank it up a little bit. So if you look at weather reports, the closest weather reports we have come out of DC, it's probably topping, mid to upper 90s during the battle, and humidity wasn't high. But if you take into account that heat, and it hadn't really rained in like 3.5, 4 weeks, the dust and all that, I mean, it's just it's a miserable experience. Anything else? How you doing, Matt Kohler? It's one of my former students. All right, we're going to head up this way.